It was a brisk autumn afternoon when Karen walked into the local coffee shop, her favorite place to unwind after a long day. The small town of Oak Ridge had always been a peaceful retreat, but today there was something in the air. As Karen ordered her coffee, she noticed a man sitting at the corner table, his red MAGA hat catching her eye. Her heart rate quickened. It wasn't just the hat, it was everything it stood for. The symbol was a blatant reminder of everything she despised: divisiveness, racism, and the rhetoric she associated with a leader she couldn't bear. She tried to ignore the discomfort that began to creep into her chest, but couldn't help herself. It was as if the hat was calling out to her, challenging her to take action. She stared at the man, then back at the barista, hoping for an intervention. But no one seemed to care. The man sipped his coffee calmly, oblivious to her growing anger. With her pulse racing, she made a quick decision. She wasn't going to let this man sit here, unchallenged. She reached for her phone, dialing the local police. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end sounded professional, but Karen's breath came in sharp bursts. She couldn't believe she was doing this, but something about the man in the MAGA hat felt like an affront to everything she stood for. There's a man in the coffee shop, Karen said, her voice trembling with irritation. He's wearing a MAGA hat, and I think he's a provocateur. I'm not sure what he's trying to prove, but it's making everyone uncomfortable. Could you send someone to check on him? The dispatcher remained calm. Ma'am, we'll send an officer over immediately. Please stay on the line until we can get there. Karen felt a rush of vindication. The man would get a taste of what it felt like to be challenged in public. After all, people like him, people who wore that hat with pride, didn't deserve to walk around with no consequences. This, Karen thought, was her moment to stand up for what was right. The coffee shop was quiet, except for the low hum of the espresso machine. Karen kept her eyes on the man in the hat, waiting for the police to arrive. She stewed in her own anger, replaying the news stories and conversations she'd heard about the dangers of political extremism. To her, the man's simple act of wearing a MAGA hat wasn't just an expression of political views. It was an endorsement of the hate and division she saw spreading across the country. Minutes passed, and Karen's impatience grew. When she saw the familiar flashing lights of a police car outside, she felt a strange sense of relief. Finally, someone would make him see the error of his ways. Her mind raced as she watched the officer approach the door. But when the officer stepped inside, everything changed. It wasn't just any officer. It was Chief Daniel Thompson, the very same man wearing the MAGA hat. Karen's heart dropped. She recognized him instantly. Chief Daniel Thompson, the respected police chief of Oak Ridge. He walked in with a calm, measured stride, his uniform sharp and professional, yet the MAGA hat sat atop his head like an unwelcome symbol. Karen's mind raced, her previous anger now replaced with confusion. Why was the police chief wearing that hat? Was he publicly endorsing the very same divisive rhetoric that she despised? Is there a problem, ma'am? Chief Thompson asked politely, his eyes not filled with anger, but curiosity. His tone was respectful, measured, as if he were simply another citizen going about his day. The rest of the coffee shop patrons looked between Karen and the chief, awaiting her response. Karen's throat went dry. She had expected a confrontational figure, someone who would challenge her beliefs. Instead, she found herself facing a man who embodied both authority and the very symbol she had called the police to remove. Her anger faltered. I didn't know it was you, Karen stammered, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. The room was still, the tension palpable. Karen glanced around, realizing the other customers were watching, waiting for her next move. Chief Thompson didn't seem to mind their scrutiny, his posture unchanged. He glanced at the other patrons briefly before returning his gaze to Karen, as if his identity and choice of hat were simply matters of fact. He wasn't defensive, wasn't outraged by her call. He was just there. Karen felt her pulse slow, but her thoughts raced. "I didn't mean to make a scene," she said, her voice trembling. The chief nodded slightly, his calm demeanor not shifting in the slightest. The fact that he was the one in charge, the one who could have easily reprimanded her for making a false call, was lost on him. Instead, he simply asked, "Is there anything else I can help you with?" As the conversation continued, Karen began to realize the gravity of the situation. She had assumed that the man in the MAGA hat was just another political provocateur. But here, in front of her, was someone who wore the same symbol with confidence and authority. A man who had sworn to protect and serve his community, regardless of his personal beliefs. The realization hit hard. Her call to the police had not only been based on her personal bias, but it had also been a public display of her own prejudices. She had judged him solely by the hat on his head, not by the man behind it. The truth was clear now. She had made a serious mistake. Chief Thompson didn't chastise her. He didn't raise his voice or accuse her of anything. Instead, he simply gave her a calm, knowing look. "It's easy to judge someone based on what they wear," he said softly. "But there's always more to the story than what meets the eye." Karen felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't expected him to be so understanding. In fact, she had anticipated a much more confrontational reaction. But Chief Thompson was not just a man of authority. He was a person who understood the complexities of human nature. For a moment, the weight of his words hung in the air. The coffee shop felt smaller now, the space between them heavier with meaning. Everyone in the room, including Karen, had been part of this moment. It wasn't just about a MAGA hat anymore. It was about the assumptions they made every day, based on what they saw on the surface. Karen didn't know how to respond. Her mind was a jumble of thoughts. She had never imagined that she would be on the receiving end of a lesson in tolerance from someone who, in her mind, represented everything she was against. But there was no denying the truth in Chief Thompson's words. Before she could say anything, a voice from across the room spoke up. "You should have called the police just for the hat." The voice belonged to a man in his mid-30s, his arms crossed over his chest. Karen turned to see that he was staring at her now, his expression unreadable. The man's question struck Karen like a slap. She hadn't even considered what her call to the police might have meant for the chief, or how it might reflect on her. Her mind was caught in a swirl of emotion, guilt, frustration, and a deep sense of discomfort. Chief Thompson, sensing the growing tension, turned to address the man. "It's all right," he said, raising his hand in a calm gesture. "We all have our moments of judgment." His tone was gentle, yet firm, reminding everyone in the room that no one was above making mistakes. The man who had spoken fell silent, perhaps considering the police chief's words. Karen sat in silence, processing everything. She had let her own biases lead her to act rashly, but in doing so, she had exposed something deeper. In her eyes, the MAGA hat had come to symbolize everything wrong with the political landscape. But in Chief Thompson's eyes, it was just a hat, one of many symbols in a complex world. The incident, though uncomfortable, was a turning point for Karen. She had confronted her own assumptions in the most unexpected way, and though it was painful, it was a lesson she would never forget. As the day wore on, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that she had learned something important. The shame she felt from her earlier actions was still there, but it was tempered with a new understanding. People weren't just the labels they wore on the outside. Everyone carried their own history, their own story. For the first time in a long while, Karen found herself questioning not just others, but herself. What had she been missing all this time? As Karen left the coffee shop that day, she glanced at Chief Thompson one last time. His hat still sat there, almost like a badge of defiance. But now, it didn't bother her as much. It wasn't the hat that mattered. It was the man who wore it. She didn't know what to say, but she knew one thing. Sometimes, the hardest part of life is accepting that you've been wrong. Days passed since the coffee shop incident, but Karen couldn't stop thinking about it. Each time she drove past the coffee shop, she felt a tight knot in her chest. She hadn't seen Chief Thompson again, but she knew that the encounter had changed something inside her. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about assumptions, biases, and the lines they drew between people. One afternoon, as Karen walked into the local grocery store, she was surprised to see Chief Thompson standing near the produce section. He was wearing civilian clothes now, no MAGA hat in sight. For a moment, she debated whether to approach him, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. Finally, her curiosity got the better of her, and she walked over. "Hello, Chief Thompson," she said, her voice a bit tentative. He turned around with a warm smile, immediately recognizing her. "Ms. Karen, good to see you again. How have you been?" he asked, his voice as calm and friendly as ever. The small talk felt strange. Karen fumbled for something to say, unsure of how to start. "I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation," she admitted, her voice soft. The grocery store was bustling with activity, but in that moment, it felt like it was just the two of them. Chief Thompson's friendly demeanor remained unchanged. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, his eyes kind. "It's always good to question things, even the things we think are set in stone." Karen nodded, her thoughts racing. She didn't know why she was speaking so openly with him now, but she felt compelled to. "I made a mistake," she confessed, feeling the weight of her earlier actions once again. "I judged you without knowing you. I judged you based on a hat." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm sorry." The chief looked at her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Apologies aren't necessary. It happens. But what matters is that we learn from it." He paused and added, "I'm not offended by the hat, but I understand why it can be upsetting to others. Politics have a way of dividing us, even when we don't mean for them to." Karen was taken aback. She had expected an apology from him, but instead, she found understanding. It was exactly what she needed to hear. As they continued talking, Karen began to realize how deeply her views had been shaped by the political climate. It wasn't just the MAGA hat that had upset her. It was the symbol of everything she thought was wrong with the world. She had allowed politics to consume her sense of identity to the point where she couldn't see beyond the labels anymore. Chief Thompson's calmness was the key. His ability to see the humanity in others, despite their differences, made her think. She had been so focused on the divide that she hadn't allowed herself to look for the common ground. The chief didn't just represent the police force. He represented a more nuanced view of the world, one where differences didn't have to lead to conflict. "I don't agree with everything I see around me," Karen said, her voice quiet but resolute. "But I'm starting to understand that it's okay to coexist with those I don't agree with." The chief nodded. "That's the challenge, isn't it? Coexistence. It doesn't always come easily, but it's worth the effort." When Karen arrived home later that evening, she found herself reflecting on the conversation. It was one thing to have an intellectual understanding of coexistence, but it was another to put it into practice. Could she really accept people whose views were fundamentally different from hers? The thought lingered in her mind like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. She spent the next few days reading articles, listening to podcasts, and even watching interviews with people she didn't agree with. The more she engaged with different perspectives, the more she realized how much she had closed herself off. Politics, she realized, wasn't the only thing that divided people. It was the judgments they placed on each other based on those divisions. Karen wasn't sure if she could change everything about her thinking overnight, but one thing was clear. She was trying. And that, she knew, was a start. As the weeks passed, Karen noticed subtle changes in how she interacted with others. She began listening more, really listening, to people with views she disagreed with. At work, her colleagues noticed a shift in her approach to debates and discussions. Where she once interrupted or dismissed opposing views, she now found herself pausing, taking a moment to consider what was being said before responding. But the real test came one afternoon, when she ran into a friend of hers, Lila, who had always been a strong supporter of the MAGA movement. Lila had invited Karen to join her at a political rally. Normally, Karen would have outright refused, disgusted by the thought of being in the midst of such a crowd. But now, with everything she had learned, Karen found herself questioning her instinct to shut down the conversation before it even began. "Lila," Karen said, her voice steady, "I think I'd like to come with you. I want to understand better." Lila was taken aback. "Really? You're willing to give it a chance?" Karen nodded. "I think it's time I listened without judgment." The political rally was an overwhelming experience for Karen. It was loud, energetic, and filled with people shouting their beliefs with fervor. But what struck her most was the sense of camaraderie among the crowd, despite their differing opinions. As Karen stood in the middle of it all, she couldn't help but notice the complexity of the people around her. They weren't all extremists or hateful. They were people with deep convictions, some of which she didn't agree with, but others who were simply trying to make sense of the world as they saw it. Karen spent the day talking to various people at the rally, hearing their stories and understanding their perspectives. By the end of the day, she felt emotionally drained but also enlightened. The experience had shown her that the people on the other side of the political divide weren't just caricatures. They were human beings, each with their own motivations and histories. As Karen drove home from the rally, she reflected on everything she had learned. She had walked into the event with preconceived notions, expecting to feel disgusted or out of place. Instead, she had felt a sense of connection, even if only for a fleeting moment. She was beginning to see that understanding didn't mean agreeing. It meant acknowledging that people's beliefs were shaped by their experiences, not just their politics. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but Karen knew she was on the right path. The rally hadn't changed her views overnight, but it had opened a door to a more compassionate, open-minded way of thinking. Despite her progress, Karen still found herself wrestling with her beliefs. The world was still politically charged, and her old instincts to shut down conversations with people she disagreed with often resurfaced. But now, instead of reacting with anger, she took a step back, reminded herself of the lessons she had learned, and chose to engage with empathy. One evening, Karen received an unexpected message from Chief Thompson. "I heard about your visit to the rally. I'm glad to see you're opening up to new perspectives," the message read. "I hope the journey continues to be one of growth for you." Karen smiled, feeling a sense of warmth. The chief's words had meant more to her than he knew. The next test of her newfound perspective came at a dinner party hosted by a friend. The topic of conversation quickly turned to politics, and Karen felt her heart race. As old arguments flared around her, she felt the familiar temptation to speak out, to shut down the conversation before it could spiral into anger. But then, Karen paused. She thought about Chief Thompson. She thought about the conversations she had had with people at the rally. Instead of jumping into the fray, she quietly listened. She realized that this moment, too, was an opportunity to practice the same principles she had been working on: listening, understanding, and resisting the urge to judge. Karen's efforts weren't always smooth. There were days when her frustration with opposing views flared up, and she had to remind herself to pause and think before reacting. But each small success, each conversation where she took the time to understand someone else's point of view, built on the last. Over time, the process of breaking down her biases became easier. The real breakthrough came one evening when she ran into Lila again, this time at a local cafe. "You've changed, Karen," Lila said with a smile. "You really seem different now." Karen nodded, smiling back. "I think I'm starting to get it." Despite the growth Karen had experienced, she still found herself facing moments where her old habits resurfaced. She could feel the temptation to judge, to label people based on their political beliefs or appearances. But now she was more aware of it. There was no magical switch that turned off her biases. It was a constant challenge, but each time, she was getting better at recognizing them before they fully took hold. One evening, at a dinner party hosted by a friend, the conversation turned to politics. As expected, the discussion grew heated quickly, with friends exchanging sharp words over issues that were deeply personal. The room became tense, and Karen felt that familiar urge to speak out and defend her views. But this time, instead of jumping in, she took a deep breath. "I think we need to listen," Karen said, her voice calm but firm. "Maybe we won't agree, but we owe it to each other to understand where we're coming from." Her words hung in the air for a moment. The argument continued, but now it was different. There was a momentary pause before one of the guests, a staunch conservative, looked at her and nodded. "You know," he said, "I never thought of it that way before. Maybe I've been too quick to judge too." Karen smiled faintly. It wasn't a victory. It was a small shift, a crack in the wall of division. As the months passed, Karen's journey toward understanding became less about reaching perfection and more about embracing progress. She had learned that change didn't always happen in big, dramatic moments. Often, it was the small, quiet choices, the conversations, the self-reflection, that led to the most lasting transformations. At work, Karen began to notice the effects of her new mindset. She had always been known for her sharp, sometimes cutting remarks during debates. But now, she found herself pausing before speaking, taking the time to truly consider others' viewpoints before responding. When an old colleague who had once been a vocal critic of her approached her for a discussion about a heated political issue, Karen approached the conversation differently. She listened first, asking open-ended questions instead of assuming she knew what the other person believed. To her surprise, the conversation went smoothly. They didn't agree on everything, but they didn't argue either. Instead, they found common ground, not in their political ideologies, but in their shared desire for peace and mutual respect. That was a victory for Karen, small but meaningful. Several months later, Karen found herself back at the coffee shop where it all began. The once contentious MAGA hat, the source of so much anger and misunderstanding, now seemed almost irrelevant. Chief Thompson, who had become an unlikely mentor in her journey, sat at his usual spot, looking over a file. He wore the same red cap, but Karen felt no irritation, no rush to judge. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of appreciation for the calm, steady presence he represented. As she approached him, she noticed something new. There were other people sitting around him, engaged in deep conversations, discussing everything from local news to political issues. What struck her most was the respect that seemed to permeate the conversations. People disagreed, but they listened, respected each other's perspectives, and did so without the usual rancor or division. "Hello, Chief Thompson," Karen said, pulling up a chair next to him. "Ms. Karen," he replied with a smile, looking up from his papers. "How's the journey going?" Karen leaned back in her chair, a smile creeping onto her face. "It's a lot harder than I thought it would be," she admitted. "But I think I'm starting to get it." "You're doing more than getting it," he said gently. "You're living it." For the first time, Karen felt the full weight of his words. It wasn't about perfect answers or closing every gap between differing views. It was about a willingness to try, to keep engaging, to build bridges, even when the world felt divided. And with that realization, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. The world might still be divided, but Karen had taken the first steps toward something that felt real and meaningful, toward understanding, not just of others, but of herself. Karen had spent months grappling with her own beliefs, each conversation becoming an opportunity for growth. But the true test was still ahead. How would she continue to carry the lessons she had learned into the future? The encounter with Chief Thompson had changed the way she viewed the world, but Karen knew that growth wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a continuous process. One afternoon, Karen received an invitation to speak at a community event. The event was aimed at bringing people from different backgrounds together to discuss political differences in a constructive manner. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just a year ago, she would have avoided something like this at all costs. Now, she was asked to be a part of it. When she stood before the microphone, the crowd was large and expectant. She had prepared a speech, but she realized quickly that what was on the paper didn't matter. What mattered was being honest. She looked out at the audience, her heart beating faster. "I've spent much of my life thinking that I knew the answers," Karen began, her voice steady but raw. "But the truth is, I've been wrong about so many things. I've judged people based on their appearances, on their words, on their hats. I've believed that if someone didn't agree with me, they were my enemy." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "What I've learned is that we're all just people. We have different experiences, different histories, but we all share this same world. And it's time for me to listen more and judge less." The room was quiet, and Karen could feel the eyes of the crowd on her. For the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt connected, not just to the people in the room, but to the world outside. After the event, Karen felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Speaking openly about her journey and hearing the stories of others who had walked similar paths reaffirmed everything she had come to believe. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. It required vulnerability, honesty, and the courage to admit when you were wrong. She met with Chief Thompson again a few weeks later, this time over lunch. "I did something today," Karen said as they sat down, a soft smile on her face. "I spoke at a community event. People seemed to listen." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "You? Public speaking?" "I never thought I'd be the one up there," Karen admitted. "But it felt right. I think we all have something to say." The chief smiled warmly, a knowing glint in his eyes. "That's the beauty of it. We all have something to say. It's about creating space to hear each other." While Karen's personal journey had been transformative, the town was still wrestling with its own political divides. Despite the efforts of individuals like her and Chief Thompson to foster understanding, the underlying tensions remained. Karen's conversations with people at work, at the grocery store, and even within her family became more complex. Some were receptive to her new outlook, but others were resistant, unwilling to consider any viewpoint that challenged their deeply held beliefs. At a family dinner, Karen found herself face-to-face with her brother, who had always been a staunch conservative. The political tensions between them had once been a major source of frustration and distance. But now, Karen felt a shift inside herself. She wasn't looking for agreement. She was looking for understanding. "I know we don't see eye to eye," Karen said, breaking the silence at the table. "But I want you to know that I'm not here to change your mind. I'm here to listen to you and to understand why you believe what you do." Her brother hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Maybe that's where we've gone wrong, Karen. We don't listen enough." It was a small step, but in that moment, Karen felt a glimmer of hope. As time went on, Karen began to notice a ripple effect. Other members of the community started to talk more openly about their own experiences and biases. It wasn't a movement, at least not in the traditional sense, but it was something quieter and more intimate, a shared commitment to listening, understanding, and refraining from judgment. Karen joined a local group that focused on community building and bridging political divides. The group wasn't about persuading others to change their minds, but about offering a platform where people could speak without fear of judgment. The members didn't always agree, but they respected each other's stories, a practice that slowly but surely helped heal some of the fractures within the community. Chief Thompson, too, became an unlikely leader in this effort. His calm presence and ability to listen to everyone, regardless of their political leanings, earned him the respect of even the most vocal critics. He wasn't pushing for a particular ideology. He was advocating for the simple, yet radical idea that everyone deserved to be heard. One sunny afternoon, Karen found herself walking through the park, her thoughts drifting back to everything she had learned. The town wasn't perfect, and the world still had its share of division, but things were different now. She had changed. And in some ways, the world around her had too. As she passed by a small group of people sitting on a bench, Karen smiled. She had made an effort to listen to each of them, whether they shared her views or not. They were strangers, but they were also a part of the community she now felt connected to. Their differences no longer seemed as threatening, and their common humanity stood out more than any political label. Karen's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Lila. "I've been thinking about our talk the other day. I know we don't always agree, but I think we're making progress, aren't we?" Karen typed back a response. "Yes, we are. Little by little, we're finding our way." As she looked up at the clear blue sky, Karen felt a sense of peace she had never known before. She wasn't perfect, and neither was the world, but she had taken the first steps toward something better, something rooted in understanding, compassion, and the willingness to listen. And with that, she realized that sometimes change starts with one person and ripples out to touch many.